I want to start with a reaction. Not a quote, not a statistic, a reaction. Because I think the reaction is the whole story. In January 26, Elon Musk stood in front of an audience at the US Saudi Investment Forum and he said, "Work will be optional within 10 to 20 years. He said AI will handle essentially everything. That means work, as we have known it, becomes a choice. And the room didn't exhale. People didn't lean back. They didn't feel the relief you would expect from a species that has spent most of its history doing things it didn't want to do just to survive. So the reaction in that room, online, and in the conversation I've been having since was something closer to dread. Now, there is another voice worth bringing in here. Yuval Noah Harari. And I'll say directly and upfront, I don't agree with him on everything. He has a tendency to paint in very broad strokes, and some of his conclusions I find too deterministic, too recite. But there's one thing he's been saying for years that I think deserves to be taken seriously. He talks about what he calls the useless class, not as an insult, but as a structural prediction. He argues that a growing portion of humanity will become redundant due to the technological advance. Not because they failed, and not because they weren't smart or skilled enough, but because the system moved on and left them without a role. Now, I don't think that's inevitable. And I don't think useless is the right word for what happens to a human being when their economic function disappears. But the underlying challenge he's pointing at is real, and I think it's more personal than he makes it sound. Because the real challenge isn't economic redundancy. The challenge lies in identity. When the work is gone, or optional or automated, what do you build your sense of self on? Where does your ego find its ground? And that question, Harari is right, is one that most people are completely unprepared for. Because nobody asks them or nobody tells them that they have to prepare for it. Because the system never required it. And that's what I want to talk about today. Not about the technology and not the economics. The interior question that both Musk's optimism and Harari's warning are circling around without quite landing on. And let me ask you something directly. And I want you to actually sit with it, not just process it. If you didn't have to work, not tomorrow, not next year, but right now and never again, you didn't have to work anymore, what would you do? I asked myself that question many times. Sometimes superficial and sometimes with real honesty. But I found it truly difficult to get to a real answer. Usually some quick answers come up to fill the silence. And if you sit longer, you don't find directly an answer. What I found was silence. But the kind of silence that has weight to it. The kind that tells you something is there, underneath, that you haven't looked at directly. I've spent now more than 25 years studying personal development and philosophy and thinking seriously about meaning and identity and what a life is actually for. And still, that question, asked honestly, produces silence. So it's worth to understand that this silence is actually a signal. And it's worth following the signal. We have to dive deeper into the silence. And here's what I started to find when I stayed with it. Most of what I had been calling my ambition, when I looked at it carefully, wasn't entirely mine. It was somehow assembled. Piece by piece from a system I never consciously chose. The school and education system told me what counted as achievement. The professional world told me what counted as success. And the culture I lived in told me what a man in his 40s should be building toward. And I had taken all of that in. And I called it my goals. But then I started asking, if I subtract what was assigned to me, what was expected, what was rewarded, what was important to the world around me, what actually remains? And that's a harder question than it sounds. Because for most of us, the subtraction leaves less than we expected. Not nothing, but less. And that gap between what we thought was ours and what actually is, that's where the real discomfort lives. And that's also, I think, why Musk's declaration landed the way it did. It didn't just threaten our income. It threatened the scaffolding we'd been using to avoid that question entirely. Because when the necessity of work disappears, even hypothetically, the question it exposes isn't anymore what will I do for money. The real question it exposes is who am I when the structure is gone? Now, many of you watching this have spent decades mastering something. Years of effort, sacrifice, deferred living for building expertise, for professional identity, for a place in a field that recognized you. And now the thing you traded for is increasingly available for free, or at least close to it. So what was the bargain exactly? And I'm not asking that rhetorically. I mean it as a genuine question because I think the answer determines everything about how you experience what's happening right now. And if the bargain was, I will trade my time for security, then the disruption is primarily economic. Difficult, but manageable. And there are practical responses to that. But if the bargain actually was, I will trade my time for identity, if the expertise wasn't just what you did, but who you were, then the disruption is something else entirely, and no practical response will touch it. And most of the professionals I've worked with over the past 3 years are dealing with the second kind. True, the economic disruption is real, but it's the identity disruption that keeps them up at night. The sense that the thing they built themselves around is becoming optional. And here's what I've noticed. The ones navigating it well are not the ones who found a new external purpose fastest. They are the ones who had already done some version of the interior work. Who had already asked, at some point before the disruption forced the question, what they were actually for. Not what they were good at, what they were for. Now, let's slow down a little bit here and go a little bit deeper, because I think it's the heart of it. When the external necessity of work disappears, when the structure that has been telling you what to strive for, what to value, what your days are for, when that dissolves, you are left with the freedom that most people never had to face. And freedom, real freedom, can be terrifying, because real freedom removes excuses. You can no longer blame the job. You can no longer blame your boss. You can no longer say, I would do something meaningful if I only had the time. Because the time is there, but the necessity is gone. And suddenly, the question is entirely yours. Striving towards something you actually chose, or towards something you inherited and never examined. And most of us, if we are honest, have been living the life that was expected of us. Doing what one does. Working because working is what people do. Not because we chose it from the inside. And that's not a moral failure. And I was in the same situation for many years. It's just what happens when external structure is strong enough to make the interior question unnecessary. The point is, the interior question doesn't go away. It sits there and it waits. And when the external structure weakens, through disruption or through the redundancy, or through a declaration that work is now optional, the question comes up. Quietly. Or with full force. And the ones who find that terrifying are the ones who have never built an answer. Not because they couldn't, but because they never had to. And now we reach to the question, how can we find a meaning when work is suddenly optional? For example, I do things that are really hard. Things nobody requires me to do. There's no external structure demanding that I get up before dawn and run, or spend hours on a bike, or push my body to the edge of what it can sustain. For me, that's entirely optional. And I'm not doing that for the performance or for the finisher photo. Not anymore. Because I recognized that the meaning isn't in the finishing. It's not in the medal or in the time or in the achievement. Right, those things matter, but they are not where the meaning lives. The meaning is in the reaching. In the act of extending towards something that isn't guaranteed. In the experience of being fully engaged with something that requires everything you have. And we all have this. There's something in all of us that needs to reach toward something. Again, not for the achievement, for the reaching itself. Now, take that away or make it optional in the wrong way, the passive way, the way where you simply stop, and something essential goes quiet. And this is what I think both Musk and Harari are missing in their framings. Musk sees optional work as liberation. Harari sees it as redundancy. But neither of them is asking the deeper question. Do you know how to generate your own reasons to reach? Because if you've been relying on external necessity to do that for you, if the job has been the thing that made the reaching feel justified, then optional work isn't liberation. And it isn't redundancy. It's exposure. So here's something I've watched happen up close in the people I work with. People arrive at midlife, having successfully become what the world asked them to become. They build the career, earned the credentials, performed the role, and then something shifts. A restlessness comes up. A sense that the life they're living, however successful, is not really theirs. The professional identity, the role, the title, the expertise, it's real, it's functional, and it serves a purpose. But it is also a mask. And the danger is when we forget that. When we fuse with it so completely that we can no longer distinguish between the professional self and the actual self. We lose access to something. The deeper, more complete version of who we are, underneath the role we've been performing. And the disruption of that professional identity, whether by AI, by redundancy, or by a career that simply stops making sense, is experienced as a kind of death. Because in a real sense, something is dying. But here's what I've watched in the people willing to stay with it. It's not about fixing it or replacing it immediately, but actually stay with it in the moment. They find out that stripping away is not only loss. It becomes an opening. A question they'd been deferring for years, finally impossible to defer. Who am I when I'm not performing the role? And that question is your invitation. And midlife is only a crisis when you're refusing that. And that's exactly the challenge Harari is pointing at, even if he frames it too fatalistically for my taste. The reconstruction of identity and ego when the external scaffolding falls away is really hard. It requires something most people have never been asked to develop. It requires the capacity to know yourself from the inside. The capacity to generate meaning from the inside. To create your own reasons to reach. To know what you value when nobody is assigning your values for you. That capacity is not automatic. And it's not given. It has to be built deliberately. And usually you build it through difficulty. But most of us have been so busy performing the external life that we never build it. The interior life, the examined life, the life where you actually know what you think and feel and want, independent of what the system rewards. And that's not a luxury. In the age we are entering, it is the most practical thing you can develop, because the external structures are going to keep shifting. And AI won't be the last disruption. The pace of change is not going to slow down. And if your sense of who you are and what you're for is entirely dependent on external structures remaining stable, you're going to continue to keep experiencing disruption as a threat. Now, the alternative is not to become indifferent to the external world. It's to build something inside that doesn't require the external world to stay the same in order to function. I think of it as the owned life. The life you would choose if you had to choose it again, knowing what you know now. Not the life that was handed to you, or assigned to you, or that you fell into because it was the path of least resistance. The life that is actually yours. And honestly, most of us have never fully asked what that looks like. The external structure kept the question at bay. It gave us enough to do, enough to strive toward, enough identity to wear, that the deeper question never became urgent. But it's urgent now. So let's get back to where we started. Musk says work will be optional. Harari warns that many people will find themselves without a role, without a function, without a clear answer to the question of what they are for. Both of them are looking at the same thing from the outside. One with optimism and one with concern. But what neither of them is talking about is the interior work. The work of actually knowing yourself. Of building a sense of who you are that doesn't depend on what you produce, what you're paid for, or what the system currently needs from you. Or finding out, honestly, not theoretically, what you would reach toward if nobody was requiring you to reach. And that's the question that's on the table right now. Also for me, I'm still working on the answer. Not because I'm lost, but because the honest answer keeps going deeper than I expected. And eventually it's also a moving target. It doesn't matter as long as you're reaching out for it. But what I've stopped doing is filling the silence quickly. because the silence is where the real question lives. And the real question, not the career question, not the AI question, but the one underneath both of them, is whether the life you're living is the one you would choose. And that's what I want to leave you with. Not to answer right now. Just to sit with. The way we all have to sit with it. Without rushing toward resolution. And if something came up for you watching this, I would really like to know what it was. Not the polished version. The one that showed up in silence.